preserving and interpreting the colonial history of the Virginia frontier. George Mercer Company, the garrison of Fort Loudoun, is ready for a patrol. The massive Fort Loudoun overlooked downtown Winchester, Virginia. England and France, with allied countries, engaged in a series of wars lasting around 100 years. 7 of those years, 1756 to 1763, were called the 7 Years' War. The conflict had land and sea battles around the world, according to Mr. French. In North America, the 7 Years' War was referred to as the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War in North America was a struggle between France and England for the control of North America and its fur trade. Both England and France used Indian tribes as allies in this conflict. France based its claims on the 1669 exploration of the Ohio River by Robert La Salle. In 1749, Céloron de Blainville buried a series of lead plates along the Ohio River, reinforcing the French claim to the area. Otters were found along the rivers and lakes by the fur trappers. Great Britain based its claims on land drained by the Ohio River on the 1671 Batson-Fallam expedition. Kercheval stated that there were several instances of the Indians committing murders on the whites about the Potomac and South Branch several years before Braddock's defeat. He goes on to write that about the year 1752, James Davis was killed up the Potomac, and in the succeeding year, William Zane and several of his family were taken prisoners on the South Branch. The French and Indian War in North America actually lasted 9 years, from 1754 through 1763. The Nemacolin Path brought the French and British into direct contact in the Ohio Valley. Christopher Gist, an agent of the Ohio Land Company, signed the Treaty of Logstown with the Delaware and Shawnee, giving Virginia control of the Ohio Valley. George Washington spent some of his youth surveying land on the western frontier of Virginia. In 1753, Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent a diplomatic mission to Fort Loudoun near Lake Erie. The mission, led by George Washington, was charged with asking the French to leave the Ohio Valley. Doman states a young George Washington in the red coat representing Virginia and the British government meets with the French commander at Fort Loudoun to request that they leave the area. The French refusal to leave the region led to the Jemansville incident in the French and Indian War. As the group traveled by raft down the Allegheny River, the waters became rough and Gist and Washington fell overboard. The two spent the night on an island with their clothes frozen to their bodies. Indians did not see land as private property, and boundaries were not strictly defined. The British tried to avoid difficulty by negotiating treaties with the Indians. Indians saw agreements as changeable. Europeans saw treaties as binding. The French advantages included a larger land claim, an already existing system of forts in the Ohio Valley, a majority of the Indian tribes as allies, and superior military officers and army. The British advantages included a larger population, powerful Iroquois allies, control of the oceans, a population concentrated in a relatively small area, and a desire to protect their own property. Many natives didn't feel that the French were as much of a threat due to the French focus on the fur trade rather than colonization. Governor Dinwiddie ordered Captain William Trent to return to the confluence of the Ohio River to build a fort. In May 1753, Dinwiddie ordered Washington to return to the fort at Trent's backup. Before he reached the site, Washington learned that the French had defeated Trent. They had destroyed the partially built British fort and constructed one of their own, which they named Fort Duquesne. Commanding a British force, Washington returned and defeated a French detachment in a skirmish at Jumonville Glen in western Pennsylvania during the spring of 1754. Washington's troops killed 10 Frenchmen, including their leader, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The war between the French and the British had begun. Washington ordered the rapid completion of the Great Meadows Fort. Fort Necessity was the name he gave the small, quickly built fort. On July 3, 1754, 1,600 French soldiers and Indians attacked the British fort. After a rainy, day-long battle, Washington surrendered his forces. Washington was required to leave the Ohio Valley and not return to the area to build forts for a year. A map of the North Central American colonies during the war. The next summer in 1755, General Braddock led a British army to the forks of the Ohio, now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to capture the French Fort Duquesne. Braddock had companies of Colonel Washington's Virginia provincial troops, some with blue and red regimental jackets, but others still in civilian clothes. Virginia regiment uniforms changed from the all-red of 1754 to the blue and red worn from 1756 to 1762. Native warriors reported the advancing British to the French at Fort Duquesne. Part of Braddock's army passed through the eastern panhandle, camping at Evans Fort, then on to Fort Loudoun and Winchester, crossed Hampshire County up to Okonoco, where they forded the Potomac at Fort Cox en route to Fort Cumberland. On July 9, 1755, nearing their target, Braddock's column was surprised by a large force of French and Indians coming out of the fort. In savage fighting, the Indians fired from behind trees while the British stayed in lines along the open road. Washington, serving as an aide to General Braddock, showed leadership during the battle and in helping the mortally wounded Braddock. The British forces were hit from 3 sides. After the battle, Washington led the retreating British forces back to Fort Cumberland on Wills Creek in Cumberland, Maryland, and on to Virginia. Fort Cumberland was on a hill overlooking the Potomac River. A few days later, while still in Pennsylvania, Braddock died. To hide his body from Indians, Washington had him buried in the road and the retreating army to march over the grave. Kevin O'Malley sketched the burial.